Greetings and welcome back to another edition of Perspectives. It's been quite a while, I think, since I've done this type of podcast, but there is special occasion. Now, originally, after my sojourn or my trip to Ukraine, which only lasted 5 days, I should remind you, I wanted to sort of do my own brief reflections video on it, but I thought it would be better to integrate it into a greater video or a larger video with someone with a great deal of expertise regarding the former Eastern Bloc countries, those countries which are now no longer part of the now defunct and dead Soviet Union, but which have in very interesting way all sort of gone in their own unique direction, which is to say, after the Soviet Union fell apart, they kind of did their own thing. And of course, we want to address Ukraine. I'm here with Alexander MGTOW. For many of you might know, his true expertise in life is actually East European politics, economics, and history, in addition, I believe, to Africa as well. And I will be letting him speak, but first I just want to offer some basic impressions I had of Ukraine. Having only been there 5 days, yet, and only in Kiev, I had a very... Well, the first thing that I noticed is infrastructure. You know, I got the queues in the airports and how they were checking the passports. It just took forever. A big surprise. I whipped out both my Hungarian and my American passport. They seemed to prefer my American, so whatever. And my host, who was giving me the tour of the city, picked me up at the airport. And we get in the taxi cab, and I'm looking in the back seat, and there are no seatbelts there. I'm thinking, well, there are no seatbelts here. And it's a few degrees minus zero, right? And the roads are all iced over. It's really dangerous. It's snowing. I'm just thinking, okay, this is interesting. So, after a rough flight, I get in there, and I check in this hotel, which clearly had sort of Second World origins, looked very sort of Soviet style, with some modern improvements, and just lots of little things. The metro, this sort of 40s style escalator that descended like hundreds of meters into the underground. Apparently, at least in Kiev, there are no bus schedules. You just wait for the bus there until it comes. So I basically got the impression that compared to the rest of Europe, and I also mean Central Europe, places like Poland and Hungary, Ukraine is pretty backwater. And I say that objectively. I'm not criticizing them for it. A lot of other interesting things. I mean, like every man there looks like he's the fifth cousin of another man. I suspect there might be some founder effect or some inbreeding going on there. In any event, it was an interesting experience, but if we're going to talk about Ukraine being a bit backwater and sort of being behind the times, not entirely, but it didn't give me the impression of Europe as I know it, especially Western Europe, but not even places like I said, Hungary, even Poland, even Romania. I think is I've been to Romania once, seemed better than Ukraine. So without further ado, I guess we should just ask Alexander. I mean, this impression I got, I've read other accounts online, and I've done research as well on the level of corruption. Like bribery is kind of like a normal thing there. So what the hell is going on with Ukraine?
First of all, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here.
Likewise. So, that's of course a question that cannot be easily answered. What is going on or what is going wrong with a country like Ukraine? Ukraine is a very peculiar case when it comes to the countries of the former Soviet Union. Since it is, I think, with Tajikistan, the only country which is actually worse off in terms of GDP growth and or GDP size and many other human development indices than it was during the Soviet times. So every other place has massively improved, even the Russian Federation, in comparison to Soviet times, even with sanctions being in place by the European Union and the United States for, I think, more than 2 years now. Even they have massively improved in comparison to Soviet times. Same goes for the Baltic states especially, even Kazakhstan, Belarus, you name it. Everybody is, to a vast degree, much more better off than he was in comparison to the Soviet times. And the only countries that are actually worse off are Ukraine and Tajikistan. And Tajikistan is, as most listeners might know, a war-torn, civil war-torn Central Asian country bordering Afghanistan. No, they have
No?
some mineral resources, not really oil. They might have a few oil wells, but it's not really an oil producing country. Kazakhstan has lots of oil, and to some degree, Uzbekistan has oil and gas. But Tajikistan is mostly very mountainous, and they have a few mines for like, let's say, precious minerals and all that. But nothing really that can serve as a basis for, let's say, mass welfare or massive economic development. So it's a very backward country that is, for the most part, not much different in terms of economic development from its neighbor Afghanistan. So, and Ukraine basically falls into the same category to a degree, as it is the other only Soviet, post-Soviet country that couldn't really, let's say, reap the benefits of the transformation.
Can I ask a question? I mean, so, and I'm not questioning your knowledge here, your wisdom, but it seems hard to believe that in the current year, wow, I'm saying it too, 2017, or at least the teens, that the state of Ukraine is actually worse than it was prior to 1991. I mean, of course, I'm skipping technological developments like the internet, but you're saying overall things like infrastructure, GDP, health, all these things are actually worse now than they used to be.
Yes, indeed. And there are several factors contributing to it. One factor is that the economic basis of Ukraine has been, for the most part, coal and steel, both of which are basically cheap commodities by now. So we do not live anymore in the 1950s where, let's say, steel was in high demand and in some countries even had a steel shortage. So where you could earn a lot of money. Now you have countries like China who basically produce relatively high quality steel at a very cheap price. And for places like Ukraine, which do fall in some sort of in-between category, it's very difficult to compete with that. The other part is that coal is the same story. Most of the coal today comes from, let's say, open mines in South Africa or Australia, which is much more cheaper than, let's say, digging down hundreds of meters or even more. As you have those kind of mines in Ukraine, which are, of course, at some point less competitive. And the other thing is that for the most part also Ukraine, because it had these energy-intensive industries, relied on cheap energy, on energy subsidies actually from Russia, which in the process of separating from Moscow have of course been gradually reduced and now abolished. And so there have been several factors, and that is just one of, let's say, probably at least 10 or 15 major factors contributing to the fact that Ukraine is trapped in what you might call is a suboptimal maximum, something from which it is very difficult to improve, obviously. The other factor is, major factor is that politically Ukraine is divided and has always been from the early 90s on. Because it's ethnically diverse.
But, you know, when I did subsequent research on the country when I returned, and I was looking up bribery and like the level. This seems to be probably the most common form of corruption. When I arrived at the airport, there were signs in English as well as Ukrainian and Russian. No corruption for our country. Bribery is going to be fine. I mean, that instantly kind of set something off in my head. I thought, well, if there are signs everywhere indicating that, there must be a problem with it, because if I walk around in Germany or France or even Hungary, you don't have signs, saying don't engage in corruption. I mean, I'm just wondering why this particular issue with bribery and sort of corruption, Bestechlichkeit, is such an issue in this country, whereas compared to even like as you cited, maybe Belarus, maybe it is an issue there, but not quite as much.
No, Belarus actually is quite orderly for a post-Soviet country.
yeah. So, and we'll get to that, I guess. But why is bribery such an issue there? And why is it? Because I've read it affects the academia, the justice system, police, education. It's just everywhere. Yeah.
I mean that is basically a symptom of an affliction. So We have to look at the underlying conditions, which does enable that amount of corruption taking place. Well, of course, number one factor is, of course, the very low income. Well, let's say a policeman who lives on 150 euros or 200 euros or maybe 300 euros, but is supposed to pay, in some cases, prices as in the West. Let's say for food, for certain commodities that he needs to live. Will be, of course, very susceptible to bribery, and even for relatively small sums. So let's say for $20, $30, you can basically, I don't know, you can buy yourself free from, let's say, speeding with 120 miles an hour in the city. Yeah. And that's basically where it starts. A judge who maybe makes $400 or $500 is very susceptible to bribery. If you pay him $1,000, that's 2 months' income that he desperately needs, and you might win your case.
Yeah. Well, I know there was one thing that was very apparent to me when I was there. Probably my favorite thing. I didn't really like too much about the Ukraine, but the prices. I went there with to a pretty high-end restaurant with my host. Mm-hmm. We ordered drinks, 2 drinks each, appetizers, main meal, and dessert. In the end, in a relatively expensive major city in Germany, that probably would have been at least 60, maybe even as much as 90 euros. We paid a little over 20 euros equivalent for. I mean, that was shocking. It's so cheap there that if you earn a living in euros or dollars, something that's just sort of normal in Germany, you could live like a king there.
Absolutely. But the problem is that because of the bribery and because of an historically very weak and unorganized government, if not chaotic, the situation is that you might not enjoy your wealth. Some government official might just, forge some kind of documents accusing you of some sort of crime you never committed, lock you away, and somehow your company ends up in their hands. Or suddenly you need to repay so and so many taxes, which, what are you going to do? Go to the courts?
Right. Well, the courts are corrupt too, presumably. So
yeah.
It's just sort of a circle of corruption.
Yes, indeed.
You got to sort of figure out. I imagine it. I think you originally referred to Ukraine as sort of the Africa of Europe. That degree of. I originally was skeptical, but when I looked up the level of bribery, which was, ranked along lines of places like Honduras and Guatemala, basically third world shitholes, essentially.
Yeah.
I was a bit shocked. I didn't, of course, get that impression, being a tourist there for 5 days, but I could see that the infrastructure was very poor. There was no bus schedule. I asked my host, well, what do people do? Well, they just, they kind of memorize approximately when certain buses come. As I was trying to figure out, every time my host would pick me up from the hotel, it was always at a different time. And I was thinking, I originally thought, why is this person always coming late? And then I only found out that, well, the bus comes at different times all the time because there's no fixed schedule. And it was shocking.
Which kind of illustrates when I said it's a chaotic state. The state itself, the state organs, and basically everything that is more or less public service is chaotic. And it has been for a long time. The thing is that it might have to do with the ethnic divisions a lot also, which is probably one of the underlying conditions being responsible for that. I remember that there was, I've forgotten her, I think, I forgot the name. It was a Russian Soviet feminist writer, woman, and she lived in Ukraine and gave birth there, and in her diary she's basically, and that was in Soviet times, in those better days, she was talking about rats in the hospital, in the newborn ward. Yeah. Okay. And holes in the concrete in the building. So it has always been a problematic place, even during Soviet times. These problems haven't gone away.
I did visit the museum, the Chernobyl museum. I didn't actually head out to Chernobyl, but yeah, I think you suggested that the negligence, fahrlässigkeit, that led to this accident. You think it might have to do with just this natural inclination Ukrainians have to be less than competent at certain things, I guess.
Yes. So it's an all-encompassing problem. The negligence, or as the Germans might say, Schlamperei, or it's I think rather the more appropriate term. So the outright chaos and disorder is very much one of the symptoms that has always been attributed with Ukraine, even during Soviet times. Now you have to imagine, and that may have also played a role in the Chernobyl accident, which was ultimately human failure. Due to, well, basically outright incompetence of the staff running the shift. So it was basically something, you could basically say if something was going wrong in the USSR, Ukraine was a prime candidate for the place where it could go wrong.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, I mean, so we've spoken some about Ukraine. I also want to offer some impressions. I mean, one thing, and I suppose it's related to this, is that you arrive there and you're walking around Kiev, and it's in the middle of winter basically, so it's fairly cold, and I could actually appreciate this. The people look very grim and very sort of just very serious. People rarely smile, they don't really laugh, they go about their business. Even in Germany, where people are not quite as superficial as they would be in the United States or other places, I mean, there was a marked difference. It was the people just had this sort of very people were just doing their thing. People were talking, of course. You go in the underground, and there were shops or whatever, but you didn't have this sort of superficial smile plastered on people's faces, laughing for no reason. It's like people didn't really look happy. I don't know if they were or not. I kind of looked at it as a much more honest way of dealing with people. Like they're not, in the United States, the way people greet you is, they ask you how you're fucking doing. I mean, Nobody does that even in Germany, and
nobody wants to hear how you're doing.
Right, and it was so different. And I guess maybe this is my own interpretation. I would imagine I use this expression that maybe when you do get a smile or laughter in a place like in Ukraine, it's sort of well earned. Like there's a reason for it. It's not just let's just conform and I'll be superficial and happy and pretend everything. I kind of appreciated that. I mean, there's one thing I did like about it. It just you didn't have any of the superficial bullshit that even affects, I think, German society to some degree, not as much as the United States. But I think it creates a kind of honesty in people's expressions and how they just present themselves to the world that is fairly unique compared to the rest of Europe. Although I would also suspect that if Ukraine ever did recover, became more Western-like or more modernized, then some of this would disappear. I think a lot of that sort of grim, dour expression that a lot of them had is obviously related to living a hard life. I mean, not
exactly,
not because they it's just the way they are.
I mean, it's the way they are because it's the kind of world they live in. I mean, if you think for Ukraine, there have been several, let's say, breaking dawns, attempts to reinvent itself, attempts to improve, and all of which have failed. Now, they had their independence in late 1991, 1992, and the great hope was that they will catch up with the West. At that time, Ukraine had many promising industries. They had aerospace industry, steel, car manufacturing, everything. They had a promising agricultural, at least potential. I mean, they had Soviet mismanagement, but the agricultural potential certainly is there. So they would have thought, well, they might have had many platforms on which to actually grow the country out of the problem, and it hasn't worked. Then they had the Orange Revolution, which they thought will bring them closer to the European Union and henceforth to European subsidies. Now, that Maidan Revolution basically got stuck in its tracks. Because the European Union was quite reluctant to admit such a big country with so many people and so many problems. And then they had the second Maidan, which basically then resulted in what today can be known as a Ukrainian civil war. And that has resulted, well, I mean, honestly, even if the wages are low, even if the taxes are low, even if you can just bribe away, all sorts of government and tax officials, who would like to invest in such a country? Now, if you're an entrepreneur and you're going to invest hard-earned cash, why would you choose Ukraine, where you probably could have some competition would close down your plant? By bribing more or bribing somebody you don't know, or whatever kind of connection you don't have. So as a result, all those dreams and hopes of a new beginning and finally to see the country improving, they have all evaporated. And I think now, what do we have now? Almost 3 years into Maidan. I think the patience is running out, and probably the country hasn't seen yet its worst political upheaval. That's my personal take on it.
So as bad as, because I remember I'm looking at a picture with regards to the Orange Revolution, where I stayed, the Hotel Ukraina,
Yeah.
it overlooks the Maidan Square.
Yeah.
And these days, when I was there in late December, there are pictures, basically memorial pictures to all the men. Well, it's like 99% men. There's a woman too, who died in this Maidan uprising. And there are obviously ongoing problems in the Crimea region, or at least in those areas. It's not safe, if you want to say Ukraine is safe at all. But
I mean, Crimea actually is quite safe because Crimea severed itself from Ukraine. It's now part of the Russian Federation.
The surrounding areas, then, rather, perhaps.
The border area, I would definitely avoid at all costs, because you never know, there might be an exchange of a round of bullets, and if they might think you're a spy or whatever, and you might be interrogated by the secret police, which in turn either results that you will have to bribe your way out, or you will actually run into deep trouble. And then, of course, there's Eastern Ukraine, which I would heavily avoid at the moment.
Right. But I mean, you're saying that all these issues, including the most recent one, with the so-called annexation and the things that happened in the Maidan Square and what have you, I mean, you think there's worse to come. You think that this is, this has been bad, but there are definitely worse things that we will from the outside, thankfully, witness taking place in Ukraine.
My prediction is that as a unified country, the country will not survive. The Western, and that has a lot to do with its ethnic and even religious affiliations. Now, if you look at Western Ukraine, the area around the city of Lviv and Tarnopol, those places, which for the most part used to belong to Poland, these people living there, basically the real Ukrainians, you might call them, they're actually ethnically quite different, and also linguistically. They speak almost a more West Slavic language, much more closely related to Polish than it is to Russian. Then around Kiev in the center, the population is, well, kind of mixed, or as you might say, more opportunistic. So at some points they are greater Russians, and at some point they are pro-Western, want independence. It really depends, what's happening. You could always say that Kiev was sometimes voting for a Western candidate from Western Ukraine, sometimes voting for an Eastern candidate from Eastern Ukraine, depending on how the mood was. And then you have Eastern and Southern Ukraine, which is Russian.
Regarding this, my host speaks Russian to the family because the parents and the grandparents came from a Soviet background. But I remember riding in the taxi cab back and forth, particularly on the way back to Germany, and the taxi driver was engaging in a conversation in Ukrainian with my host. So I can see the sort of code switching. I think my host described it as being more comfortable sort of emotionally with Ukrainian, but Russian is sort of more...
I mean, for the most part, when you go to Kiev, people speak Russian. That's the everyday language.
Yeah.
If you go to Lviv, people will speak genuine Ukrainian because that's what they actually speak. Yeah. And for all those other places, be it Kiev, be it Odessa, be it Donetsk or Kharkov, this Ukrainian language has never been endemic there, has never been at home there. I mean, they had an accent, or you might say a heavy, sometimes even a heavy accent or dialect, but it was, genuinely Russian that was spoken there.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, we've talked about a lot of the problems that are afflicting Ukraine, and my impressions. There was also it was an eerie experience. I remember visiting the. I wanted to check out some of these Orthodox churches because you just don't see that in the West. And the people there were very religious, both the men and the women. They would go up and kiss the pictures of saints and sculptures and things like that. And and not too far away from that as well, we visited the old Soviet World War II monument, as well as the Holodomor monument, which was totally eerie. It was cold, and of course it's set up where you could look upon the city landscape in the middle of winter, and it had this really eerie, creepy sort of bell ringing thing. It was surreal, actually. That was a really surreal experience. But Ukraine is in this really bad position. But when you compare it to other countries, I mean, I think we've talked about this privately, but Estonia, of all the former Soviet Union, I guess, republics or countries or however you want to term it, seems to be the poster child for success.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done my own research because I've been interested in, the sort of internetization of everything, services and relatively low income tax and sort of efficiency. Yeah. It seems to be the polar opposite of a place like Ukraine, despite the fact that they're so close to each other. What do you think accounts for these huge differences? Is it just the size or something else entirely?
Well, it's very difficult to say whether it's the size or not, because there are other very small post-Soviet countries like Moldova, which are, even a bit worse than Ukraine, or it's at least on the same level. But it's true that Estonia has had very, let's say, competent governance. Estonia has, but it doesn't fall out from the skies, actually, because even during Soviet times, Estonia was, let's say, a place of quote-unquote consumer high-tech for the Soviet Union. So they were making telephones and I think even TVs and all sorts of equipment and stuff, and also software, producing software within the Soviet Union. So when they became independent, they just basically continued on some level what they have already been building on during Soviet times. Yeah, but whereas Ukraine was heavily relying on rusty, dusty industries like coal and steel and the likes. So that was basically the basis. But the governments have been way more competent in Estonia, and it's not that Estonia does not have division. Estonia has, let's say, 25% Russian speakers.
Yeah.
So they have integration-wise way more difficulties and way more differences, even ethnically and linguistically, than, let's say, the people from Lviv and the people from Donetsk. Yeah, but they have somehow managed, they have built an orderly, clean country. To be honest, if I would be some sort of venture capitalist investing in Europe in some sort of tech startup, and I would be choosing a country or a city for my headquarter, I would definitely include Tallinn into, let's say, the top 3.
Well, from what I've read, Tallinn is sort of regarded as almost like the Silicon Valley of Europe in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
That's where you want to go to do a tech startup. I mean, Skype, which we're using, was created by Estonians.
Yeah. So. And there you see these people have received some sort of education experience very often even during Soviet times, because when it comes to telecommunications and all the software and technology involved, they were actually working on it even before the independence. But they have made clever use of it. That is a difference, let's say, in comparison to Ukraine, which basically got bogged down. I mean, let's say the Estonians acknowledge that they have problems, but then they've just gone, to work, working and having economic success. Whereas the Ukrainians have basically continued in dabbling in political divisions and talking about language and talking about accents and talking about whether there should be Russian-speaking or Ukrainian-speaking movies in the cinemas and all that kind of nonsense. And actually, the Estonians have been way more pragmatic on so many levels. They have been a bit more restrictive when it comes to voting rights and passports. That is true. But when it comes to practicalities every day, they have been way more, let's say, conciliant than the Ukrainians.
Yeah, so basically, the picture you're painting is one that makes me think that one of the reasons why the Ukrainians are just kind of lost at sea is because they've gotten bogged down in all these trivialities, whereas the Estonians said, let's just deal with all this shit and just get it over with.
Well, more or less it boils down to this. At least this is the difference in behavior that we can see. I mean, of course, as I said, there was a difference in what kind of economic basis they had. I mean, the Ukrainians had an economic basis that that has seen its heyday 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And the Estonians had an economic basis that was just about to take off.
Yeah.
And that was certainly one of the bigger differences contributing to that. But acknowledging it, it's not that, let's say, Germany has not had technology, or France or Italy. But they, in comparison to the GDP, didn't capitalize so much on the internet and on let's say, software and offering software products or apps or whatever than, let's say, in comparison Estonia, which is a country with no, relevant natural resources, nothing really.
Now, but here's the thing. Estonia, well, for obvious reasons, was quickly absorbed in the European Union. Now, there are the Baltic states, Latvia and Lithuania. They're obviously not quite as bad off as Ukraine, but they're also not doing great. You look at the stats. Lithuania has the highest suicide rate in Europe. Latvia's is kind of like, my impression, and I've met actually a few Latvians don't want to even be in Latvia. They just kind of leave to go to the UK or Germany or some other place, So it's kind of, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the Baltic states evolved in the post-Soviet world and why they're sort of not quite the optimal place, but still somehow better. They were able to enter the European Union at least.
Entering the European Union, as we know from the example of Greece, at the end of the day, it boils down to how a country does its homework. So entering the European Union, as many, of course, in Eastern Europe thought, is just opening the doors to, massive prosperity and money falling from the skies, and right. As the Russians say, cucumbers growing into your mouth. You don't even need to pick them; you just lie down and they basically grow into your mouth. You just bite them. From all those three countries, you immediately see that Estonia has a more decent infrastructure. Of course, they don't have German autobahns, but they have roads that work. They have roads that are maintained. They have roads that are clean. They have roads without all these potholes. Now, if you travel to Latvia, you will, it's basically a bit like a train ride. Most places in Lithuania are not much more better. Latvia is another problem. The Latvians, unlike the Estonians, have also become too much bogged down in those nationalistic trivialities. It doesn't mean that they do not exist in Estonia. They do so, but they take way less space. In Latvia and even Lithuania, all this division between the endemic people and the Russian speakers who moved there during the Soviet times has been way more hysterical. Way more hysterical, talking about the same way you have people talking about white genocide in the US because birth rates for whites are dropping. And you had the same talking points literally down to a T from, let's say, Latvian and Lithuanian nationalists, and somehow blaming it on the Russians, on Moscow and Putin and whatever nonsense.
Interesting. So effectively what's been going on is that, people getting lost in, I guess, what some might somewhat consider trivialities or things that are maybe not quite as important. It really depends on your perspective, obviously. But compared to the Estonians, who are just much more practical about everything.
Yes.
Estonia, not technically, obviously not part of Scandinavia, but it seems to run, in some sense, in a bit like a Scandinavian country almost.
Yes, indeed, at least when it comes to order and being clean. That's something that immediately jumps to your eye, whether you compare it with Russia or anything else, basically, in the region. Estonia is, as I said, the best organized country. But it's because, I said, the people governing the country understood they only have this one chance if they want to dig themselves out of this post-Soviet misery. And they have just made the right decisions. They have been bothering with how can we use the internet to let's say, save on expenses for public services, to make public services cheaper for the taxpayer and more effective. For the most part, if you live in Estonia, you don't need to go to any office. You have a sort of console and you have a card. That is your ID card. You insert it and then you can do basically everything from your tax returns to registering to voting, even almost anything. You don't need to go anywhere unless you have a court appointment or something like that. Yeah? And the other countries, the parliaments, instead of thinking about this, they have been talking more about what did Zhirinovsky say in the Russian television about Latvian milk, which is completely irrelevant. It's not contributing, and they've been blowing shit like this out of proportion. Or let's say in Riga there is a monument. I don't know if it's still there. I haven't been in Riga for some time. Basically honoring the SS, the Latvian SS members. Now I do even understand why the Latvians might honor them, because they were not seeing the Germans as occupants. They were seeing the Germans as some sort of let's say liberators from communism, from Stalinism. But why making a monument for this? That there's maybe 50-60% of Russians living in Riga. Is that really necessary? And what does it really contribute? It doesn't make the Russians more. It doesn't make the Russians go away. It doesn't make the Latvians more pure. It doesn't grow the economy. It doesn't solve any of the relevant problems, from potholes over, let's say, cutting down on bureaucracy or taxes or incentivizing investors. It does actually the opposite.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean,
now imagine, let's say you're an Israeli tech firm and you're going to Riga and you're saying, oh, what a nice place, cool people, intelligent people, engineers and all that. And then they will say, and here, by the way, is the statue for the Latvian SS. What are you going to say? You're probably going to say, okay, well, that's it. Yeah, just for an example. Doesn't even need to be an Israeli. It can be anybody. Even a German would say, well, would cringe, actually.
Well, especially a German might.
Yeah.
Considering.
Yeah, and the Estonians have been, in some level, as I said, they have some bullshit of that, but they don't take it so serious on some level. And Lithuania, for some part, has been even more hysterical because they have actually only 8% Russian speakers. Lithuania is the way more, let's say, ethnically cohesive country. And they have been blowing this thing completely out of proportion.
Yeah.
They're still talking about being invaded by Russia.
Well, there was, I'm trying to remember, one of the worst guerrilla wars that had taken place on European soil in recent times was essentially a Lithuanian resistance movement towards Russian occupation, was there not, if I recall right?
That was after World War II, I think, the
right.
Woods brothers, or how them. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But yeah.
So maybe they feel it more acutely. I don't know.
They feel it more acutely, but interestingly, they have been least affected by Russian or Russian-speaking immigration and all that. And you always have to know that in the Soviet family of republics, if you might term it this way, the Baltic states have been always a bit, let's say, pampered. So as the investment plan was made, essentially, there were certain republics that were preferred and certain republics that were, of course, massively neglected. And the irony is that preferred countries were, for the most part, Belarus and the Baltic states. And the countries that were neglected, especially, or the places that were neglected for the most part, was actually Russia proper. So actually, the Russians have saved on dropping the USSR, saved on subsidizing other countries, other places.
Interesting. Now, we talked a little bit privately about this. This notion that even during Soviet times, Ukraine was problematic, and that say a guy like Putin would rather just not even deal with them at all in some sense. Whereas, my limited understanding of the Crimean annexation was that this is basically the Crimeans felt they were Russian, and it really wasn't an annexation so much as, we're Russian anyway, so let's just join the Russian Federal Republic or whatever.
Yes. That was basically what happened. So in Crimea and for some parts in eastern Ukraine, the people speak Russian and they feel Russian. And I remember some Russian friend has told me one of the most Russian patriotic cities is Sevastopol. And Sevastopol at that time was part of Ukraine. It's the main city in Crimea. And at that time it was part of Ukraine. He said you will never see more Russian flags than in Sevastopol. not even in Russia proper. And so when the Maidan happened and when there was the counter movements in the south and in the east, that the Crimeans will be the ones who will pull the trigger immediately was actually not a surprise at all to me. And I remember with friends we have been discussing even the first Maidan in 2004, the Orange Revolution. I said, guys, at some point you will head for a civil war.
Yeah, but I have to base this on my own research and what you've told me, hardly being an expert on these parts of the world, but if Ukraine is sort of regarded as the shithole or the Africa of Europe, if Russians think, like, as you said, even Russians steer clear of Ukraine,
yeah,
what interest would there be in a civil war? I mean, from my host told me, they said, this person said, well, look, yeah, the Crimeans consider themselves Russians. They're not really part of Ukraine, so that's that. So what else could there be?
Well, I mean, there are basically the whole south coast up to the way to Odessa. Then you have the whole east from Kharkov down to Donetsk. We actually have in Donetsk and Lugansk an armed resistance that has basically created a de facto independence from Kiev. And that they have, yes, of course, with Russian help and lots of volunteers joining from not just even Russia, but of course mostly from Russia, helping them. But at the end of the day, such an endeavor cannot be successful if there is not the local people who support it. Yeah. So and what we might see is that at some point resistance, even in those places that are still more or less under Kiev's control, like Kharkov or Odessa, even there, the situation might at some point erupt. And I know that there are many reports from what I hear is that they heavily crack down on pro-Russian or anti-Ukrainian or anti-Kiev government sentiments. But, repression only works up to a point. Yeah. It's basically like a rubber, and you can stretch it, and then it snaps. And when it snaps, it usually hurts. Yeah. So my prediction is that the civil unrest might in fact be in a few years way worse, coupled to the economic situation of Ukraine than it is today.
Well, let's talk about everyone's favorite topic. I mean, this is all kind of a MGTOW related subject, I suppose. But I touched down in what is it called, Borispol again?
Borispol.
Yeah.
Borispol,
and I'm in the queue to make sure I'm sort of verified to go through, and I'm noticing several couples of German men talking to wives who are speaking German in an accent that sounded sort of Russianish or maybe obviously Ukrainians, with their children in tow. None of them happy. It seems that they might have been the guys who married the beautiful Ukrainian woman who turned out to be, well, maybe not that great, I don't know. But there's this notion you get from tradcons all the time that, go to Eastern Europe because there you'll find the traditional wife who will sweep you off. She'll be submissive and devoted and obedient, and she'll take care of you, and you'll come home from work and she'll be sitting on the bed with her mouth open ready to suck your dick. That is after a home-cooked meal, and blah, 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 blah.
But my response would be, why don't you ask the local guys if that's the case or not? And the local guys will probably share a very different reality with you that is unfortunately not that pleasant as some of these Western tradcons describe it. I mean, there is the fantasy about the submissive Eastern woman, whether the woman is Asian or Ukrainian or Russian or whatever, but the reality is that these women do bite as do all women basically worldwide. So, no, they are rather not submissive. And they divorce their own husbands in the same fashion and dump them on the streets and have them evicted and take away the kids and collect alimony and child support and whatnot. In Russia and Ukraine, everywhere. Yeah. In those places.
Well, I mean, something obviously is to do with the level of infrastructure and things we talked about, the chaos of the place. Doing a little research for myself, seeing the difference in life expectancy between your typical Ukrainian man and your man in the United States or Germany, there's a significant difference of maybe 4 or 5 years in some cases. And you look at these guys, like I said, who seem almost kind of inbred, but they have this sort of bloodshot eyes. They're clearly drinking. Like every one of them, I immediately knew who was Ukrainian flying there. I sat down with these guys with that sort of square face, had a beer in his hand or a bottle. It just, you know, I don't really, and I looked around, and maybe all the attractive women have fled Ukraine, but I couldn't see, I wasn't looking actively, but I couldn't find any women that I thought, well, wow, you know.
You have to go in summer. The days are longer and the skirts are shorter then.
Right. Probably the wrong time of year, but still, I think this is something that people just can't get, men specifically can't get through their heads, that women are women. It doesn't matter if they're Ukrainian or Russian or whatever.
I tell you even something from my anecdotal evidence from friends and people I know who live there, and etc. Is it actually what I hear is actually they are quite violent in intimate partner relationships, really violent. So you might call it passionate, but unfortunately that passion doesn't manifest itself in getting your dick sucked or in the bedroom, but it manifests itself that she will basically try to hit you or kick the crap out of you, when you don't do what she expects from you. That's what I hear, actually. So if you believe you can go there and just be happy and have a blissful marriage, well, go knock yourself out, but literally.
Oh, man. It's interesting. So, I mean, that and that's just a universal. I think the same, I mean, women are women everywhere. I've heard recommendations to go marry Hungarian women. Well, yeah. And my father has a friend, Hungarian, actually lives there, and I think he's been divorced twice. He's gone through 6 or 7 different girlfriends. I mean, women are women. It's just.
I think Hungary's divorce rate is one of the highest. I think it's way above 60% even. So. Yeah,
Hungary is not the place you want to go if you want to get married. Maybe if you want to hook up, Hungarian women can be pretty exotic looking, but not the place. And then, of course, and as far as sort of Eastern Bloc, it's more central, I guess. But so Poland, you know, the beauty of Polish women and their Catholic devotion to their husbands. That's what I hear all the time.
Yeah, of course. Well, of course, I mean, the divorce rates are due to, let's say, some more complicated laws. Are a bit lower than, let's say, in the West. They may be around 40% or something like that. But that doesn't mean you have a great deal of marriages and that are failed, but nobody files for divorce. So, but the people live separated.
Yeah, I mean, the divorce is just a technicality.
Exactly.
In most cases.
And depending on the legal climate, whether it's expensive or somehow complicated because they still have some element of fault in it and whatever, they just don't grant each other divorce, but at the end, or it's maybe shame or culture, but it's not that people in Poland are happily married, no.
No. Well, I guess you have kind of a degree of expertise. Maybe you could retell that story about the guy. You mentioned this. I think you said he had married some woman from some village in far western Russia, not too far from Finland. I think.
Yeah. And let's say after 3 months he was completely, let's say, disillusioned.
3 months.
And 3 months, yeah. Actually, there is very often it's almost a custom. Marriage doesn't even mean a lot. You know, people got married, and that's something they have developed during Soviet times. You got married, for instance, as a student. You would get an apartment. Yeah? Whereas a student, you would be living in some sort of dorm, and, you know, you would be sort of, let's say, limited, rather, in your resources. So getting married early and maybe having a child early got you access to more resources from the system. This is why you still have lots of people in those places marrying very young, and also getting divorced very young. So married at 21 and divorced at 23. You actually find that very often in those countries. You can have a 24-year-old girl. She has been burning through 2 marriages and 5 abortions. Not even exaggerating. I definitely know people who like this. You know, so that is not even untypical for those places. And there goes the dream of the submissive, traditional, reliable, and loving Eastern Slavic girl.
That's the thing. I mean, half of them, based on my research and what you told me, the ones who are smart, they want to get the hell out of Ukraine. As an
Yes.
example, they don't want to stay there.
No.
They want to go to a Western country, or really any country other than Ukraine.
Yeah. So you might go there as some average guy, as a poor schmuck, essentially, and average looking, average income, and you might get some Ukrainian bombshell, and yeah, maybe for half of a year she will really do make an amazing job as a wife or girlfriend. But once she has secured what she needs to secure, she will dump you. She will make a 180 turn, and she will dump you in the probably most nasty way imaginable.
Yeah.
So the idea that you can just run away to some sort of, fairyland where women are beautiful and submissive and do what you want and whatever, that is, well, a fairy tale.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I knew, we're kind of a bit off topic, but I realized this already having lived in East Asia, where that's another popular method. East Asian women are conservative and traditional, and,
Yeah.
I experienced it personally. I witnessed it.
Yeah.
Well, it really depends what you mean by traditional. Yeah, they go through the customs and stuff, but they divorce their husbands, they cheat, all this stuff. So I think that's one thing that likely will never change. And I think that's something that men need to become aware of, obviously, that this is just a pipe dream. This doesn't exist.
No.
Whatever it might be, this, steel gray-eyed, beautiful Ukrainian woman who will suck your dick on command, and no, it just doesn't exist.
Well, actually, probably getting divorced is even not the worst thing that will happen to you. The worst thing probably is when she is clinging on to you and introducing her mother, her sisters, and whatever other kinds of failures they have in her family, trying to leech off of you. And if you have kids with that, and that's probably why you saw the poor guy at the airport, probably basically she's telling him, well, you better pay all the bills from my mom and my sister and my brother and what other kind of second degree cousin, or when we're back in Germany, I will take away the kids and then I will take you to the cleaners.
Yeah, none of the guys I saw that were married to Ukrainian women looked particularly happy. I don't see many married guys in general that look happy, but it was just clearly they had their asses dragged there. They didn't really want to go there. Like, oh God, let me just get this over with. That sort of.
I mean, other people go to Switzerland, they go to Austria, or maybe they go to some place that's actually warm and beautiful with palm trees. Let's say Australia or something like that, Bali. But going to Ukraine in December to celebrate Christmas with your mother-in-law, eating her nasty food and having, in some nasty rundown concrete apartment block, and then the question will be, oh, good that you are here because I need a new bed.
Can you pay for this, please?
Yeah. And I'm talking about not particularly beautiful places. I mean, you can find them all over the former Eastern Bloc and the former Soviet Union especially, but especially in Ukraine, you can imagine, at least in some countries, they have invested a bit into making things a bit more livable, even, accommodations. But can you imagine, when was the last time, let's say, Ukrainian apartment blocks for low-income people have been upgraded or renovated?
Yeah.
It's a long, long time ago.
Yeah, it's just really just based on brief impressions. It's a different world out there. It wasn't just obviously the language barrier, just looking at the way people express themselves and sort of go about their business. And you don't think that there's any reasonable hope of Ukraine improving to the point where it would be comparable to Poland or Hungary at least, or something like that?
Well, we can only hope, of course, but at the moment, no, I don't see a positive development there. I rather see that it could very well be that we will all witness at some point that Ukraine in its current form will cease to exist. Yeah, that is very, very possible. And there is also a good deal of, let's say, separatism also in Western Ukraine. So there are people in Western Ukraine who want to, Ukrainize the country. But there are also a lot of people, and they are growing, as what I hear from, is that they say, well, when the Easterners want to get away, no, we want to get away too. And they believe that when they will become independent with Western Ukraine, they might have a better shot at joining the European Union or coming close to Poland. I mean, put it this way: if people see Poland as a rich country, or as a situation that they look up to, you can imagine how bad it is. I'm not saying Poland is particularly bad, but if that's something like let's say Italians look to Switzerland, well, it's very hard to predict. But what I rather think in the future is that Europe knows very well that it's any investment in Ukraine is unfortunately a lost investment. So the best way would be to aid a civilized divorce of the country. And you would have those places that actually strive to join Russia and where people feel Russian and desperately want to be Russian and speak Russian and have Russian movies and whatever. Well, then just let them go with their territories. And those people who want to be staunchly Ukrainian and anti-Russian and venerate the Ukrainian SS divisions, well, let them have their own country. Yeah. Because the problem is that people always say, well, all the civil war going on in Ukraine in the east and the separation of Crimea has been some orchestrated conspiracy made possible by Moscow. And make no mistake, Moscow has aided people there. It has aided separatists there. And of course, in Crimea, the Russian army was heavily involved in orchestrating the actual process of separation, but they did so with the consent of the people on the ground. That's the point, actually, that matters. Yeah, and those tensions and divisions, they have always been there. They have been there. You will find video footage of the early 90s, even before Ukraine actually became independent, where you had people who are affiliated with the far-right, almost national socialist movement called UPA, protesting in the streets of Kiev and calling for the extermination of Russians and Jews and whatever nonsense. And they have at several occasions been coming very close to some sort of civil war. And there has been a very, very shaky compromise between the east and the west of Ukraine. And you see that in the political leadership, it has been kind of oscillating to some degree. So the first president, I think it was Kravchuk, was from Western Ukraine. Then he was followed by Kuchma, who was more affiliated with Eastern Ukraine. Then you had Yushchenko, who was again from Western Ukraine. Then you had Yanukovych, who was again from Eastern Ukraine. Yanukovych got toppled in the second Maidan. And now you have Poroshenko, who again is from Western Ukraine. And that's where things then really took a very bad turn. So at some point it was only a question of time, really, when those tensions will finally erupt in violence. And at several occasions, as I said, they were coming very, very close to a civil war, even in the early 90s.
Yeah. Interesting.
And so to believe that we can artificially, it's a bit, when I said Africa, it's actually very similar, because the borders have been drawn not by the people, or by, let's say, they haven't organically developed, let's say, as the borders of France, for the most part, or Italy. But they have developed, or the borders of the state of Ukraine at the moment, they have been developed on some table in Moscow by Communist Party leadership. And we know that it was especially under Stalin, when he was the commissar for nationality questions. And we know that the intention was to create republics that are ethnically diverse. So when they will break out of the Soviet Union, when they will break the unity, so to speak, that these countries will run into massive problems. So to a degree, the problem was built into the country. Yeah? The only differences are the Baltic states, really, despite having had massive immigration from Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and other places. Those countries have a history of independence. You know, they have a history of social cohesion. They have a history of ethnic unity, whereas Ukraine never really had that. It never really existed in that fashion. I mean, Estonia was an independent country in the interwar area. So was Latvia, so was Lithuania. But Ukraine, the western part, has been under Polish administration, and the center and east has been under Russian Soviet administration. Very similar situation is in Kazakhstan. which is calm, but you might ask, well, is it only the calm before the storm, or is it only calm on the surface? Because in Kazakhstan, you have similar situations. You have a north, which is heavily populated by Russians, or even has Russian local majorities. And then you have the south, which is basically ethnic Kazakh, along with some other minorities living there. And the difference is that in Kazakhstan, they have basically acknowledged, well, let's tolerate all the different languages, at least the Russian language, and the government of Kazakhstan
Russian is
has...
still really useful, isn't it?
Yes, of course. In all these places, it is still very useful. Maybe less so in the Baltics, but more so in the other places. Yeah, and in Kazakhstan, the government has heavily relied on support and cooperation with Russia, which is maybe one of the reasons ethnic violence, interestingly, didn't erupt there. Although there is a massive religious component, and that is growing, that is because the Kazakhs are also Muslims. And normally you would expect some sort of civil war in that place. But interestingly, it hasn't happened there. It has happened in Ukraine.
Interesting.
So it's because people, I remember that there's the mindset also with many people living there. They see the independence of countries, but in some corner of their mind, it's somehow still the Soviet Union even. Maybe not so the younger people who were born after the independence, but those who know the Soviet Union, who have been socialized and who have grown up in the Soviet Union, they look at the independence of many countries, even if they live in these independent countries, as some sort of, well, you might say aberration or historical peculiarity, or they don't really take it serious. There are many places you can go where there's no strict border control and people just, although in theory they might even need a visa or show their passports, but there's, it's just a road. And although it's not officially like in the European Union, like the Schengen zone, where you just travel from Germany to Austria, and there's only a sign greeting you're welcome to Austria. But it's de facto very similar. And people still have that kind of mindset, like it's still, at some level, even still one block, in a sense.
Yeah. When I left Ukraine, I got to be honest, I was really happy. Well, actually, I should mention this anecdotally. The airline lost my suitcase for a week.
Mm-hmm.
When it returned to me, I thought, when it was returned to me, like randomly on a Sunday or something, I thought, well, Christmas miracle or something. But it just, the place, I can understand why people want to get out.
Yeah.
It definitely makes sense.
It's the chaos. It's the lack of reliability of institutions. It's because, as I said, they got bogged down in nationalistic trivialities so much, and maybe even as a substitute for the lack of economic success, maybe even, they frankly believe if they would, let's say, outlaw, let's say, the Russian language in Ukraine, that would do anything to contribute to public wealth. On some level. Although, of course, there's, you and I would agree what should be the connection. Like, okay, you can do away with all the Russian movies, and then what? Who will earn now more money because of that? Nobody. Right? But it's that kind of ethnic tension that I think is the underlying condition for all the afflictions, be it corruption, be it chaos, be it outright negligence, that we can see in contemporary Ukraine. And that was probably on some level always part of it.
Yeah. Well, I think we covered quite a bit of ground. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Alexander? 'Cause, I'd like to eventually talk more about Africa and some of these other countries. Any further thoughts you'd like to add on? I think we've kind of explained some of the differences and how things evolved over there.
When we look at the post-Soviet space, some kind of closing words now, is that we have to look at the differences. There are countries who are doing very well. There are countries who are doing well because they have made the right decisions after the independence, like Estonia, very much so. There are countries who are doing relatively well, and I'm saying this with great care because relatively well, for the region, like Belarus. And Belarus does relatively well because it has been kind of a focus of investment already during Soviet times. Because Belarus has suffered a lot during World War II, and as such it was then prioritized by the Soviet planners. And all the kind of new industries and upgrades and new machinery was first introduced there before it was even introduced in Russia proper. So there are huge differences, but let's say even we in the West, from all the chaos, can learn one thing or two from those countries, especially from countries like Estonia, which is, let's say, focus on technology, which we don't really see in Germany. I mean, can you imagine in Germany that you can do most of your things from the internet, voting, office sessions?
It's so weird, because you'd think, but Alexander, I can't help but think that has something to do with the size, too. Germany's a pretty big country, maybe not compared to Russia or the United States, but, I mean, do you think that maybe part of it with Estonia is the size of the place that allows me, allows me.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I were there. My thoughts projected to the future. That allows the people there to just get things done in a much more expedient manner.
Well, I think it's maybe not really the size, because as I said, there are smallest post-Soviet countries like Moldova, which is even, at least used to be before the Second Maidan, even more fucked up than Ukraine. The size might be a matter of practicality when you implement a reform or a change, but when all is said and done, without a functioning governance body, even in a small country, you will fail to successfully implement any reform. I think the difference is rather that the Estonians have understood that, things have to be taken seriously, and there has to be a focus on economic development and certain degree of economic liberalization. While others have preferred to talk about things like language and propaganda and all the kind of nonsense. And to a degree, Germany, I think, in comparison, let's say, to a country like Estonia, is just complacent. We do make cars, we do make machinery of sorts, and we still live relatively well with it, up to a point. Now, what will happen, do you think, if the global car industry, due to digitalization and electrification, will lose, let's say, a quarter of its jobs? That will have a massive impact on a country like Germany. Massive impact. Yeah? And we are basically not investing enough into the future. We are investing, for the most part, in wrong places. Yeah? And that's maybe where even we here in the West, Germany, France, and the likes, can learn a lot from places like Estonia. So we shouldn't have our nose high up there and say, well, it's all just post-Soviet, chaos. I mean, or you can learn even from Russia proper. They have a 13% flat tax. Yeah. I mean, that was pretty dashing, because I recall an interview with the finance minister, German Gref, back then, who was more of a Russian liberal, or libertarian even. And he said, we didn't even know, what will happen to the tax revenues. We didn't know if we will collect more or less, and we actually expected less tax revenues, but the reality was we got more, because we lowered the tax. So it actually did work even in those places. And it takes some guts for a politician to sign something like this into law. And unfortunately, we don't have politicians of that caliber here in the West, interestingly. Maybe because we don't have the pressure.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I think I'm going to wrap this up. It's kind of getting late. But I want to thank my guest, Alexander, for joining me. Like you could clearly tell, he has a lot of expertise and knowledge about these parts of the world and history and the politics. And like I said, I think it's just better to have a discussion with someone who's knowledgeable about this rather than, me just giving my thoughts on my impressions there. But once again, thank you for joining me, and I hope we can have some more discussions in the future about related subjects. So thanks.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it was a pure pleasure.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.